Welcome to Essential EGL+Batch. This video series is based upon EGL Development Tools version 0.8. This is lesson 22. In this lesson we want to accomplish three things. First of all, we're going to go to the database development perspective and create a connection to a JDBC-compatible database. Then we're going to create a binding in EGL so that we can connect our EGL program to a JDBC-compatible database. And then we're going to create a ConnectionLib library to demonstrate that connection properties. So what we want to do is be able to create a JDBC compatible database connection. And in my case, my database name is EGL+Batch on port 50001. And I have a username of db2inst1 because I'm using db2. And this is what you want to see. This is the ping succeeded is what you need to see before you continue. Now your choice of database really is up to you. I'm not going to go into setting up the database, creating a database, installing the database software. But in this group of lessons, what we're going to do is we're going to use EGL to create a table called Table 1, and it'll have two columns. And right now I'm using data and sample content to show you what the records will look like when we get further along. EGL is being used to insert records into the table, select records from the table, and eventually to do delete queries. So this will be covered in the next few lessons. But we have to have a database connection. Now, by going this way, through the database development perspective, we've connected our IDE to the JDBC-compatible database. Well, now we want to connect EGL development environment to our JDBC-compatible database. So we need to find our EGL Deployment Descriptor for the project, open it up, and then find the Resource Bindings tab. Now the tabs are along the bottom. So we go to Resource Bindings and click the Add button, and we want an SQL binding. And then I'll click Next. We want a binding that references the workspace connection, the one that we just set up. So we'll select EGL Program, and it'll use the user ID and password that we used to connect to the database. And then we do not want in an EGL+Batch program to use the JNDI data source. So that's what our EGL program looks like in our resource bindings. And it's important to remember the name of the binding. The name of the binding doesn't have to match the connection profile. It doesn't have to match the name of the database. So it's important to remember the name of the binding. So then we go to our EGL source code, and this is part 3 where we're going to actually use EGL code to connect to the database. So we create lab.lesson22 package in EGL and a source file that's called ConnectionInfo. Now ConnectionInfo is just for this lesson, but it collects together information about the connection, actually using the connection. So there's a number of different properties that are associated with the connection, and each property has a name and a value. So that's it for ConnectionInfo. Now we need to create a library. The library is going to be called ConnectionLib. And in ConnectionLib, we're going to first work on a function called getConnection, because this function is something that you would continually use in the batch environment. It gets a connection, and basically what a connection is a SQL data source. Now when you put this in and you organize imports, you notice that it doesn't actually find the package that SQL data source is in, so you have to type this in manually at the moment. And it's in EGL EGL.persistence.sql package. And then the next thing is, ordinarily we would set up a result like this and return the result, but by doing it this way, what we would get is a different connection every time we called get connection. So we want to make this as part of the library. We want to make this a library variable. And I'll call it data source. And then I'm going to explicitly show that at the beginning, when we first have the library, the data source is null. Then the first time we call get connection, it'll it'll detect that the data source has never been used before, and it will create one. So right here is how we create one. We use the curly braces at resource and more curly braces. URI equals binding colon, and remember the binding name. That's the binding name that is used, EGL program. And then we set the data source library variable equal to DS. So the binding scheme gets us all of the information that we've set up in the EGL Deployment Descriptor. Now I'll do organize imports again. It'll detect that we need a batch lib, and we're going to use batch lib from lesson 16. But it does not detect the package for SQL warning. Again, we have to type this in at the moment by hand. It's under the same package EGLX persistence.sql. So now we have our normal library that we usually use with the normal decoration that we use, where demo function calls show connection properties, and then show connection properties is going to go and get the properties from a live connection. So first we have a variable called DS, and its type is SQL data source with a question mark, which means it's nullable. And we're going to get that connection from our getConnection function, which we just defined. Now that's going to create one instance of connection info. And then the list is going to have a collection of connection items. So these are different values that we can get from the data source, the live data source. One of them is auto-commit, which is ds.getAutoCommit. That is a property of the data source, whether it auto-commits or not. And then we have transaction isolation, which is another property of the data source. But transaction isolation is actually a code, and that's a machine readable thing, but we would like to turn that into a human readable thing. So ds.getTransactionIsolation returns an integer. We'd like to change that into something more like English, a human readable language. So we created this function called decode isolation level, which takes a level, and then based on the value of that level, and these constants are actually part of SQL data source. So it takes one of the constants and turns it into a text. And then if it doesn't match one of the predefined constants, it's going to have the value of level and a message that says is not an isolation level. And it throws an exception. Well, hopefully it'll work properly and return a string so that we can easily read the isolation level. And then a similar thing with the warning, that if there's a warning associated with a connection, we want to be able to turn that warning into something human readable. And warnings are actually nested, so you can have a next exception and a next warning. So we're going to set up a variable called result by convention, and then we're going to add warnings. And it's actually a recursive algorithm where decode warning calls decode warning until there are no more warnings. And then we get the value from the connection, whether the connection is closed and whether the connection is read-only. Now, those 5 isolation levels may or may not be supported by your JDBC driver. So I created a function called check isolation level for a given level and also a given data source. So you can pass a data source as a parameter, and you can return a data source as a return value in EGL development tools. The check isolation level is going to return a connection item record, and we format the name, which is going to be support, and then the name of the isolation level to determine whether or not the JDBC-compatible database supports that transaction level. So the name is S, and then the value is going to be ds dot supports transaction isolation level. And we're passing the given level. So that should return a nice result. And then I use that same function for each of the predefined transaction levels. Again, using the constants that are defined part of SQL data source. And then the next part is for each item in the connection items that are inside of the info. So it's basically for each item connection item from info.list, we're going to write the name and the value to the console. And that'll give us a list of the connection properties, connection settings, and display them. Next, we want to create a program called Lesson 22. And this is just a typical program. The important thing here is it calls ConnectionLib.demo. And we'll take this for a test drive. This has been another lesson of Essential EGL Batch. Thanks for watching.